seem to come out of nowhere because there isn't a context in which to place them. So the ramifications from those actions are particularly shocking. They are particularly surprising. So if we think about the collective responses to 9/11, it came from nowhere. Why do they hate us? Who are these people? It was the feelings of classic disorientation, an event that seemed to come out of nowhere. So shock is the gap that opens up between an event and our collective story. And our collective story is our history, right? It is the gap that opens up between our collective narrative. And when that gap opens up, we are very, very vulnerable. So if we think about what people wanted to do in that moment, what was the natural impulse? It was actually to gather. People wanted to talk. They wanted to talk to their neighbors. They wanted to assimilate that event. They wanted to close the gap between event and story. Because we humans need story, right? It's primal. And seeing as we are in a place of story, I thought I would mention that. And so people gathered, they talked, they went online, they went to bookstores, they went to libraries, and they desperately sought to fill that gap. So what did the Bush administration say? Go shopping, right? Which is the most isolating thing you can do. It's the opposite of that impulse to gather collectively and make sense of something together. You don't actually rebuild your story by going to Macy's. And the other thing that we heard was that impulse to look at history and try to contextualize this event was to try to rationalize that event, right? That the very impulse of trying to understand, of reading Chomsky and understanding that the CIA had funded the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, that was an exercise in rationalization, not understanding. And to rationalize was to sympathize, and to sympathize was essentially to be a terrorist because you're either with us or you're against us, right? So we heard something else, which was actually history doesn't matter anymore. In fact, the message of 9/11 is that there is a new beginning point. We are year zero, right? And we started to hear these phrases, 9/11 changed everything, right? There was a headline in a Canadian newspaper on September the 12th, which was, globalization is so yesterday, right? All that economics talk that you were doing, all of that is so yesterday. That's all pre-9/11 thinking, right? So our whole economic and political analysis that predated September 11th was just banished. No longer useful. We were reborn. We were a blank slate. And because we need stories, because this is such a human impulse, we were particularly receptive when news stories were handed down to us with nice little bows tied around them, like Axis of Evil and Clash of Civilizations and the war against Islamofascism, with lots of help from the media, who also don't like to be without a story for very long, seeing as they are the official storytellers of our culture. So they were happy. Our mainstream journalists were happy to parrot these new narratives, these insta-narratives. Now, we know what the Bush administration did with the incredible faith that was placed in it in that moment. And one of the classic symptoms of a state of shock is regression. It is that childlike state that opens up. And one of the things I do in the book is I look very closely at the CIA's interrogation manuals, where they describe all their interrogation techniques as a system of inducing regression. And they say that when a prisoner goes into a state of shock, a window opens up, a kind of suspended animation, when they are more likely to comply. And they're more likely to comply because they start to see their interrogator as a father figure. And when I read this, all I could think of was Rudy Giuliani. And I mean, this is what I mean by the fact that we've been living the shock doctrine. We have we remember that regression. Whether we felt it ourselves or we saw it in our friends and relatives, we remember it. And we regret it, most of us. Regret it, although some of us want to relive it, and that's why Giuliani has a base now. His entire election campaign seems to be, remember when I was your daddy? So we spend a lot of time now retroactively piecing together the extraordinary powers that were seized by the Bush administration in that period, through the Patriot Act, through warrantless wiretapping, through the right to wage preemptive war, the opening of Guantanamo, all of these measures. And that's really important that we're going through this process. But I still think we're missing a larger story. And that is the war on terror that was declared in this period, and the super empowered security state that the Bush administration has created through the special powers that they claim to put people under surveillance, use indefinite detention, the classification of enemy combatants, the waging of preemptive wars, the launching of the Department of Homeland Security. All of it actually doesn't make sense as a war. We understand that, right? I mean, we understand that you can't win a war against evil everywhere forever, right? We joke about that, but we understand that from a military perspective, this is an unwinnable war. But if you think about it in a different way, it starts to make more sense. If you think about it actually as a business plan that the Bush administration gave to corporate America after 9/11, and that 9/11 sort of acted as a kind of an IPO, launching a new economy, right? That in the same way that the internet launched the dot-com bubble, 9/11 launched a security bubble. Because the part of this that we still haven't fully grasped, even though we talk about individual contractors and individual corruption scandals like Halliburton and Blackwater and Bechtel, what we haven't grasped is that this entire infrastructure that we're calling the war on terror, whether it's being fought abroad in Iraq or at home through this super empowered security state, is a hollow shell. It is fully privatized. Everything that can be outsourced and privatized has been outsourced and privatized. This is the end point of the privatization agenda that we've been living with for 25 years. They've already privatized all of the arms of the state. All that's left is the core. The core is the army, the border control. The core is the running of the government itself. So this first stage was the super empowering of the security state, of those core state functions. But the second stage was the simultaneous privatizing of them. Now, one of the advantages of this is that you actually don't have to debate any of this, because it's all taking place under cover of the war on terror, which is, of course, covered under national security. And the Bush administration had a blank check to wage that war however they wished. So we find out about this in glimpses, in bits and pieces, retroactively through an individual scandal. Through the Blackwater scandal or through the Abu Ghraib scandal, we find out that even prisoner interrogation has been privatized. But we don't get the full picture, and that's the advantage of using shock and crisis to push through these policies. They create states of emergency where democracy can be circumvented and pushed aside. So if you think about it as a military plan, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But as an economic program, it makes a lot of sense. I think what we need to understand is the Bush administration, they're not an administration. They don't administer. They think other people should do that. They've outsourced administering. And the role they have played in the war on terror is not that of an administrator, but that of a venture capitalist, of a deep-pocketed venture capitalist that says, okay, here's your business plan. Here's your market. Fight evil everywhere forever. Okay. Terrorists and immigrants too, while you're at it. Diversify.